Hello and welcome to episode 88 of Linux Dev Time. I'm Joe.
I'm Amalith.
And I'm Kevin.
Good to talk to you both again. Amalith, when it comes to collaboration workflows, you don't really like the pull request model that GitHub made popular, and you much prefer an email-based workflow. Why?
Because the way pull requests work on every platform that implements them that I'm aware of, they encourage you to get all of your changes, everything that's required for this one feature, this one big feature, small feature, whatever it is, whatever size, it encourages you to get all of those changes in one place in one pull request. And often those pull requests end up massive. And when you have code review, when you have a process that requires code review before your changes can make it into production or main or whatever, the person who's reviewing your code suddenly has a ton of work to do. All the work you've been doing the past few days, weeks, has culminated in even more work for them to do. They might have to review 900 lines of changed code. And I think, I could be mistaken, but I'm thinking that is the average size of a pull request on GitHub. So your code reviewer now has to stop whatever they're doing and take the time to go over every line of your 900-line patch. That's a huge task. You're blocked while waiting for them. Other people might be blocked waiting for them. And it's just a whole bunch of people waiting while this one person goes through, maybe a few people, go through your pull request. While in an email-based workflow, or we'll take a step back and say a patch-based workflow rather than just email, when you break all your commits up into small patches and send them all at once, maybe this patch depends on a patch that comes before it, you're giving the code reviewer much smaller bites. Maybe 50 lines over here can be reviewed in 5-10 minutes. They can just take a break from what they're doing, review it, accept it. You're free to move on and continue working on more patches.
So I definitely agree that smaller PRs are better, hands down. But I wonder if this is a little bit of a size of the pull request debate over the actual style of collaboration, because I tend to fall more into the camp of the PR or merge request or whatever they call it by platform is a good thing for collaboration. However, I also very, very, very much agree that the merge request or pull request should be small, single scoped, and well-defined for the reviewer. So could it just be that an email-based workflow encourages a smaller set of patches or a smaller diff than the current GitHub PR model?
I do think so. And personally, there are other reasons why I prefer email. It's not, locked into a particular platform. It's not a platform specific feature. Pull requests, in the way that GitHub popularized them, aren't part of Git, but email is. So it's just all the tooling you need to collaborate is already installed when you install Git, is one of the other reasons I like that. And it's decentralized rather than centralized around GitHub or GitLab. If you have an email address, you can contribute to a project, that kind of stuff. The big reason, though, is that diff size.
What about just hypothetically, if there was a web-based collaboration tool that used a, let's say, email-based patch-based system? So I'm thinking in this hypothetical world where you would email patches to this system and it would then display them in a very GitHub PR-like. Would that meet the intent, or would that be right back into current GitHub PR model? Just for the sake of thought.
That's a very interesting thought.
Probably the biggest issue that I take with the email-based approach, not necessarily patch-based approach, but the email-based approach is, one, in practice, these patches end up getting emailed to a single maintainer or perhaps multiple, and then they're responsible for doing the review and doing the merge. But it doesn't happen as collaboratively as I've seen the web-based pull review version working. Now, that's not the rule, right? There can be exceptions in both directions. However, the web-based PR model, I've definitely seen a lot of collaboration where multiple people can be committing and reviewing and making changes. Now, I also agree that that leads to these much larger PRs that are somewhat of a monstrosity and nightmare to review. But I wonder if we could make the email-based workflow also get the collaborative benefits of the PR-based workflow, if that would be a win-win.
I do think that's entirely possible. How much experience do you have with SourceHunt?
I don't have any other than following it from the outside. It's intriguing. I like what they're doing. I just haven't personally used it.
There are definitely some pretty big paper cuts when you're getting into it, and even when you've been using it for years. But I do think they've done a very good job of doing exactly that. You can give multiple people write access to your repository, and you can have a mailing list on lists.sourcehut, and anyone can send in patches, anyone can review the patches, and if they have write access, they can just apply that patch, push, everyone sees it. And if you reply in line rather than what's called top posting, which is writing your reply at the very top above whatever you're quoting, replying to, when you reply in line, it inserts those comments as a comment in the web page within that portion of code. So it looks just like what happens when you comment on a changed line in a GitHub PR. And it facilitates a very high degree of collaboration. I don't know that it's necessarily the same degree, though. I haven't had a ton of experience with GitHub.
It might just be the tooling based around it or the experience with that workflow, because that sounds exactly like what I would be after, is that sort of collaboration. I think I've always seen it in the GitHub model or the GitLab model, so that might just be what I'm used to, but that sounds like what I would be after. Now, I've also heard in GitHub, at least possibly GitLab as well, and other tools, if you apply the .patch to the end of the URL of a pull request URL, you then get a patch or series of patches based off of that PR.
That you can curl and pipe into Git AM or something. Yep.
Yes. So what about with the PR model as it is, leading to these really big, massive PRs? Could some of that be a tooling or a policy issue, or is it a little bit of both? I guess what leads to these massive PRs from GitHub style, but not in the patch-based workflow?
I think to an extent, it's both cultural and tooling, because the tooling doesn't necessarily have a built-in mechanism to say, there's this PR, but before you look at this one, you should look at this other one over here, because the first one depends on the second one, for example. There are third-party tools for that. Graphite, I know, is one of them.
That's actually a great point right there. So when you were saying one PR is based on another or linked to or in some way dependent on another PR, I think conceptually when we started this discussion, I was thinking more of PRs as a single unit, that nothing else depends on it. Now, I understand in the real world that may not be the case. You need bug fix A to land first, or feature A before feature B, and so on and so forth. However, I think this is in the patch sets, you're exposing that better than GitHub currently does, because you're right, GitHub's tooling around, or I would even say really Git in general, the tooling around dependent sets of patches or PRs is very lacking and very poor. So if that's something that an email-based or a patch-based workflow makes easier, I would wholeheartedly accept that.
Now that you mention it, I don't know that there is any way in Git to say this change depends on this other change, because that first change, it either applies cleanly or it doesn't, and you've just, have a conflict now you got to go fix.
Yeah, in bare Git, it's mostly one branch being based on the tip of another branch, and so on, that can extend arbitrarily far. However, the GitHub PR mechanism doesn't view that in any sort of good way. You have to use third-party tooling. Graphite's one that you mentioned that I have a decent bit of experience with as well, and they do try to, in comment, at least say this PR is based on that one, and so on and so forth. But GitHub itself doesn't have any good tooling around that, nor is it doesn't help the reviewer as they're trying to load up the context for each individual PR to understand, all right, this is now merged, move on to the next one. Because sometimes one of the things that I struggle with, and to be clear, I love a stacked commit workflow. I'm a big fan of that. But in doing so, there are times where a change in any direction of that stack, either a lower PR that's about to merge or a higher PR that's dependent, you can end up in a scenario where you have to make changes in either of those two directions based off of something in an unrelated PR. And GitHub currently doesn't have a very good way to let the reviewer know that and or keep that context in their head as they're switching between PRs. Because let's be honest as well, the reviewer is probably reviewing other people's PRs as well. They might be reviewing multiple different commits all around the same time frame.
There is another way to look at it too, though. In an email-based workflow, when you're sending a series of patches, each one of those patches is a commit. I think GitHub might have intended their PRs to be more like a patch series because they do display commits in order, right? I think
They do, yes.
But do they show you the contents of those commits in order? When you're looking at files changed, it's just alphabetically which files changed, right?
That is correct. And that's actually a huge thing that I dislike about the PR model is when you're viewing that series of commits or series of patches as it would be in an email-based workflow, you just see it all together. Now, yes, you can click individually each commit and then go to the next one and go to the next one, but you have to do that by clicking a commit, viewing the changes, going back out of that, clicking on the next commit, viewing changes. So it's not easy to keep that context loaded in your head, especially if the changes between commits are in some way related. It's very hard to keep that context in your head in the current PR model. You just see all of it, or you have to very, very deliberately go through commit by commit.
Depending entirely on your email client, it might have built-in facilities to let you scroll through all of that at once. That's another thing. Your choice of email client makes a huge difference in your experience using email-based Git. Because if you're using like Gmail, that would be a terrible experience in the Gmail web UI, trying to read code in a sans serif font and then having to copy paste that out of your email client into a terminal, saving that as a file and then applying the patch. That's hell. That no one wants to do that. While if you have a desktop email client, preferably even in your terminal, then when you're in your source code repository, you can open your email client, go to that email, and oftentimes, especially if it's a TUI client, they'll have facilities built in for piping that entire email into some shell command. If you pipe an entire patch email into git am, it'll apply the patch cleanly just as another commit.
It's not normal to use a terminal-based email client though, right, Kevin?
I would say it's not normal in many industries. Developing might be one of those weird ones, but even there, I would say that is a niche of a niche, yes.
Like you don't use one, for example.
I do not use a terminal-based email client, that's correct.
I think many people using web-based clients or desktop clients like, I don't know, Thunderbird. I actually don't know how well Thunderbird handles patches, but I don't think it would be better than like Neomut. That's what kernel developers use. They're dogfooding both the email client and Git itself by developing the kernel.
That sounds like a hidden advertisement for Emacs.
I do use Emacs. And I use email within Emacs.
Now, I know we can say that the Linux kernel uses a email patch-based workflow. So could we say that that scales better than the PR model? I don't know how well the PR model would work with the Linux kernel, for example, especially having multiple trees throughout the community.
There are efforts to put the kernel on GitHub and allow people to contribute to it. I don't know where those are, though.
I wonder if part of this could just be settings in GitHub or GitLab or what have you that would allow enforcing policies on, say, commit size or number of commits or something along those lines when creating a PR in order to keep those PRs nice and well scoped. Now, I understand that would probably be a hard thing to do in a general fashion with all the various languages and projects out there. But I wonder if some of the tooling around email-based workflows just naturally leads to this organically. And if that's something that these more web-based clients could capitalize on and incorporate into their products as well.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by people who support us with PayPal and Patreon. Go to linuxdevtime.com/support for details of how you can support us too. Linux Dev Time is part of the Late Night Linux family, which means that for $10 a month on Patreon, you can get access to an RSS feed that contains all the Late Night Linux family shows without adverts like this. There's also an option to get just this show ad-free for $5 a month. Some of the episodes are even released a day or so early for Patreon supporters. So if you like what we do and can afford it, it'd be great if you could support us at linuxdevtime.com/support.
So earlier you mentioned Graphite, which, for those that aren't familiar, Graphite is a tool that allows you to better use stacked commit workflows. So kind of like a patch-based workflow, but still within the GitHub models, they're primary. But I believe they are GitHub only when it comes to the web UI component. But have you used their web UI at all, or their command line application?
I've not used Graphite at all. I've seen them around and listened to podcasts and been like, yes, I like these people. But it being currently limited to GitHub was a non-starter for me. But you did give me the idea to use it locally. I have not yet.
Yeah, when it comes to local commit stacks, there's a few tools out there that allow you to do that. Graphite being one of them. There's another one called Git Branchless that I really like. But overall, just being able to work in that stacked commit workflow, I think gets a lot of the benefits that you are talking about, trying to keep your PRs small and scoped down to a single thing and allow them to be dependent on one another, even if the tooling and the web UI doesn't allow you to really see that well. It allows the developer to segment their work nicely for a reviewer. I highly recommend those tools or anything like that lets you get to that style of workflows. I think we were very much aligned in that style of thinking.
Amalith, you've made a lot of technical arguments for this, but I do wonder how much of this comes down to GitHub being owned by Microsoft and you not being a fan of either.
That is a small part of it, but at the end of the day, the stuff on GitHub is open source. I work in open source. I'm going to have to use GitHub, and I do. Earlier today, I contributed to a project that was on GitHub.
So you have accepted that GitHub is a necessity?
Yeah, it's not going anywhere. I don't think open source as a whole is moving anywhere anytime soon. Maybe, actually. I shouldn't say that with their refocusing on AI. Or no, what did they call it? Refounding on AI?
Yeah, refounded on Copilot, they said, yeah.
That's what it was. With that, maybe. It's a little bit rocky. Maybe.
But it's a big old ship to turn around,
Yes.
isn't it? For the open source community to find somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you do have major projects like GNOME using GitLab, but that's only one project of thousands of projects in the open source world, most of which are on GitHub.
Yeah, GitHub has really won that developer mind share for the time being. So, Amalith, if we woke up tomorrow and GitHub magically supported an email patch-based workflow, would you be all in at that point?
Ah, that's the question.
No, because SourceHut exists. If SourceHut did not exist, I'd use Forgeo and then tell people to email me their patches.
How does a patch-based workflow work with CI and pipelines?
On SourceHut, the end experience is similar to what you get with pull requests. Someone sends a patch to a mailing list. The mailing list component recognizes that it's a patch. Then it submits the result of that patch to SourceHut's CI system. And then the CI system replies, quote unquote, to the lists system. And then the results of that build are just put in there as like another comment in the thread.
It's no GitHub Actions though, is it?
No. I don't know. GitHub Actions can be a bit of a pain.
That's the understatement of 2023.
I've heard from a number of people that they much prefer SourceHut's configuration syntax and just how the build system works in general to GitHub Actions. But with that said, GitHub Actions are really, really powerful.
Well, like a lot of things that we've talked about today, I wonder if, again, going back to the tooling, if some of it is just based on the tooling that exists and how you could make a email-based workflow integrate really well with a CI pipeline. So, for example, what I'm thinking is the patch kicks off a bunch of different actions, but not until those actions pass all the green tests would it then get merged automatically and or rebased, whatever your strategy happens to be.
You can do that. SourceHut's actions do have statuses, passing or failing, and I think you can do things based on those results.
Well, and I think just the fact that it's also using the same email system for notification is a really cool feature. I'm definitely going to have to look into this.
Yeah, I've been using SourceHut for a while, and I love it. And it's actually what my new client uses. I've been using SourceHut more lately because of my job change. We use self-hosted git.sourcehut for storing our repositories, but we use SourceHut hosted lists and to-do for the bug trackers. And they still integrate pretty well.
Interesting. So it has git.sourcehut. Does that mean they also support other version control systems as well?
Yes, SourceHut also supports Mercurial, but it's entirely community maintained. It's not official exactly, but there are trusted people who work on the Mercurial system and integrate it with the rest of SourceHut, I think.
So that makes me wonder about version control systems that are more geared towards a patch-based workflow. For example, Pijul.
I have heard of that, but I don't have any firsthand experience with it. Do you?
I've played with it a little bit, and I'm definitely interested in learning more about it. I think perhaps with this whole email-based and patch-based workflow system, that might be a good thing to look into, because I've heard that there can be merge oddities in the way Git handles merging that a patch-based Pijul system does not.
One of the things that has held me back in investigating Pijul is the only web UI and collaboration system they have right now is their Nest project, and it's built entirely to run within like Cloudflare's functions or Cloudflare workers or whatever it is. And yeah, I'm not a huge fan of relying on Cloudflare.
Well, I wonder if that's just a sign of it being a new project or one without a lot of adoption yet, and that can change with time.
The creator did describe the situation they were in before. The original web UI and collaboration system was very heavy, required a lot of compute power that was expensive, and they were looking for something cheaper. And I think Nest is, because it's built entirely within Cloudflare's ecosystem, is free.
That's how they get you though, isn't it?
Yeah. But I do think anyone could build their own third-party front end that is not within Cloudflare.
Well, I think the part that we've settled on at least is small patches or small PRs. That's the way to go.
Yes. The big monumental stuff, no.
Right, well, we'd better get out of here then. We'll be back in a couple of weeks, but until then, I've been Joe.
I've been Amalith.
And I've been Kevin.
See you later.